I'm Pam Eliason. I'm the Director of Training here at the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. At TUR, we do webinars and continuing education offerings for toxic use reduction planners, and we like to sprinkle in some refreshers on the various aspects of TUR planning. So I know not everybody in the room joining us today is actually a planner, um, but I will be talking a lot about toxic use reduction planning, and you can just think of it as alternatives assessment as well, if that's what you're more familiar with. So some of the planners who have responded to recent webinar surveys suggested they'd like to hear more on determining cost of using toxics. So that's what we're doing today. I sat in on a recent webinar put on by Change Chemistry, where they were talking about the business reasons for promoting sustainable chemistry. And there, Amy Cannon of Beyond Benign mentioned a survey that they conducted last year where they asked employers what skills they look for in new workers. And many of the responses included a need for workers who understand the economic implications of making more sustainable materials or chemicals choices. Under the Toxic Use Reduction Act, Massachusetts aims to support developing these and other skills by dictating certain actions as part of the TUR planning process. Determining the cost of using toxic chemicals is one way that TUR does that, that TURA does that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Today's webinar will spend a fair amount of time on the requirements associated with the cost of toxics under TURA. We'll break out for a small group discussion where I hope each of you will share some of the tips or questions you have for this aspect of assessing alternatives and TUR planning. And then we'll hear from my colleague, Colin Hanahan, TURI's policy analyst, who will be sharing case examples from companies who have implemented toxic use reduction over the years and how that has supported their competitive advantage in their industries. First, I want to go over the required steps involved in good faith toxic use reduction planning. We often refer to this diagram as the Pac-Man graphic. It illustrates the toxic use reduction process in broad strokes and makes the point that TUR planning is not a linear activity. So let's look at some of the main points of this graphic. First, we do the pre-planning step where we determine the scope of the plan, and that includes identifying which processes or production units at the facility use toxic chemicals. This is also where planners consider the hazards associated with covered toxic chemicals. And at this stage, it's helpful for planners to determine how the facility prioritizes the various factors that play into their decision-making. Here's also where planners engage with employees and stakeholders as they initiate the planning process. Next, we start to characterize the process, and this sets the foundation for excellent planning. There's a lot that goes into this step of TUR planning. An important point to remember is that planners need to make sure that they do this every planning cycle, which is every 2 years, because processes and practices tend to evolve. Next, planners gather the right people to help consider all the possible TUR options that may be available to the facility. Remember to consider each of the 6 established TUR techniques when we do this. And in Massachusetts, that's laid out in the regulation. And those 6 techniques are input substitution, product reformulation, process redesign or modification, production unit modernization, improved operations and maintenance, and integral recycling. So in Massachusetts, companies who are looking for ways to reduce their use of toxic chemicals must consider all 6 of those options as they think about, what TUR options are available for the facility. Then we get into the steps where we screen and evaluate TUR options that have been identified. And we look at whether they're technically feasible, what the cost of toxics is, and whether or not those technically feasible options are economically feasible. And then finally, so planners will work with the company decision makers to recommend an option to implement. And remember too that in Massachusetts and under TUR, facilities are not required to implement a feasible option. However, they must provide an explanation in their TUR plan summary as to why they've chosen not to implement an option if they've determined that it is feasible. So again, the screen and evaluate TUR options is where we do the process of determining the cost of using toxics. And so let's get into that. So why do we bother assessing the cost of toxics? Well, first of all, it's required. It is a required element under the TUR regulations. It's a way to support planners in applying the accounting practices that their facilities use for any capital decision. Cost of toxics determination creates an important baseline against which your economic evaluation of a TUR option is grounded. Companies may not realize the full cost to them of using toxics at their facilities. This is a kind of activity that is not commonly done. So even if there are no technically feasible TUR options identified, sharing the information that you develop about the cost of using the toxic chemicals that you are using can be really important information for the decision makers, and it may influence the priorities that they assign when thinking about operating a more sustainable and safer business. Finally, doing a great job here really helps strengthen the business case for implementation. And as a planner, that's one of your roles, is to make that case. So let's look at what specifically is required under the Toxics Use Reduction Act. And remember that this step happens after you have already identified a technically feasible option, toxics use reduction option, and before you conduct your economic feasibility assessment. And cost of toxics determinations must be done for each covered toxic. That's a listed toxic chemical that you have to report on because you've exceeded the reporting threshold for it in each of the production units in which it is used. If your team has identified a TUR option or TUR technique that you've determined is technically feasible, it would work for your needs, then your cost of toxics determination must be quantitatively done. You need to do calculations to determine what the cost of using the toxic chemical is. If you were not able to identify any technically feasible TUR options, then the plan must still include at least a qualitative evaluation of the cost of using toxics. And the regulations lay out 9 specific cost elements that you need to consider. And we'll go through that in the next slide. I just want to point out at the bottom here that we have a link to the guidance document that walks through all of the different aspects of toxic use reduction planning. And I think Agnes has probably put that link in the chat. Thank you for doing that. It is important to remember that you need to note in your toxic use reduction plan where the supporting documentation is for your cost of toxics determination. You want to be able to show somebody quickly, these are the calculations we used, this is the information we used. And if you have a DEP inspector come on site and ask to see your plan, you need to be able to show that to them quickly and demonstrate that you have all of that information pulled together. So just as a reminder. So what are the steps for determining cost of toxics? Remember, you need to do this for each covered toxic chemical. You need to identify the relevant cost elements, gather the appropriate data, then, pull this information together to determine what the cost of using toxics is, and then allocate those costs to the production units where the chemicals are used. Once you've done all of that, then you can move on to assessing the economic feasibility of the options that you've identified to help you to reduce your use. So this is a graphic that is pulled from the guidance document I've mentioned. It's really a helpful illustration of the process of determining if a technically feasible toxics use reduction option is also economically feasible. So step one is identifying which cost elements are relevant. And as I said, there are 9 different cost elements that you need to consider. I'll go through each of those in the next slide. If you determine that certain cost elements are not relevant, or if you find that they can't be reliably quantified, you still have to address why that is in your plan. You need to make note of that in your toxics use reduction plan. You want to be able to demonstrate what is you've thought about, what the barriers are for you, and the plan should lay that out pretty nicely. So also, if there are other cost elements that your facility uses when making decisions about financial expenditures, you need to include those elements in your cost of toxics determination and describe them within your plan. So let's look at all the potentially relevant cost elements. And these are the 9 elements that, that are laid out in the regulation. And you need to, as a TUR planner in your Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Plan, you need to affirmatively state whether each of these cost elements is relevant to either the covered toxic, to your current process, or if it's relevant for any technically feasible TUR options that you may have identified. And those aren't necessarily the same. So relevant costs, yeah, they're not, well, they're not always the same. Let's just walk through this list. And I want to invite people on this webinar to think about these cost elements as we go through them and how they apply to your facility or to your clients' facilities. We'll be breaking out for a discussion in a few minutes, so I recommend you jot down your thoughts as I go through this list so you can kind of refer to them in the breakout discussion. I really want that breakout discussion to be nicely engaging and interactive. So as we go through this, jot down your thoughts. The first relevant cost element that's laid out in the regulation is about labor and material costs. And while it's common to look at material costs associated with your processes, labor costs or changes in labor costs, if you change your process, are not always remembered, are not always included. So, here the regulation reminds you that these costs must be laid out in your plan. The second cost element is about purchasing or manufacturing costs. And these are purchasing or manufacturing costs associated with using the toxic you're looking to reduce. So you need to also consider these costs as you evaluate a TUR technique that involves use of an alternative chemical, which is, something that is often part of what you may be recommending if you're looking at input substitution or product reformulation. C, we're looking at capital and equipment costs, and that I think is something that you often think about when you're thinking about making process changes, but not all TUR requires equipment purchases. But any capital costs that are associated with your use of the toxic chemical or with the alternative that you may be considering need to be identified and should be quantified, even if only by estimates. The guidance points out that capital costs of existing equipment are typically only relevant if the company's existing production equipment will need to be replaced within the company's fiscal planning horizon. So something to think about there. And however, the operating costs of that equipment may be affected by how much of the toxic chemical you're using or wasting. So even in the cost of toxics determination, you want to think about what are the equipment and operating costs associated with that use. In D, we're itemizing various costs that are potentially associated with the handling of toxics, like storage and accumulation or treatment and disposal, et cetera. For instance, floor space required to store chemicals and materials, or in which the equipment that uses the toxic chemicals has a cost to it. So we'll hear a little bit about that from Colin later on in this webinar. For E, there are many regulatory costs that companies incur because of their use of toxic chemicals. TUR planning costs are just one. These costs include the manpower or the consulting fees that are required to develop or update your plan or to conduct your annual toxics reporting. It also includes the fee companies pay that's based on the number of chemicals they have to report on and the number of workers employed who are potentially exposed to those chemicals. But there are many other regulatory costs you should consider. So do you have volatiles that must be remediated before they're emitted to the air? Do you use toxics in a way that impact the quality of the wastewater you generate, requiring you to treat that wastewater before it's released? Do you have flammables on site that could impact how your local services, fire services, work with you? So think about those things and the costs that are associated with that. Those are costs of using toxics. F focuses on worker health and safety. And remember that one of the primary tenets of toxics use reduction is the importance of creating a safer workplace. So costs associated with doing that are covered here. And believe it or not, worker health and safety costs are often not factored into the cost of toxics determinations. So planners should be thinking about any worker exposure protections that are necessary to minimize harm and any injuries or illnesses that have or could occur if workers are exposed to the toxic chemical. So again, you'll hear that I'm using the word could or may quite a bit. This is gives you a sense of where it can be more challenging to really pin down what the costs are. But we need, as planners, to really be thinking about all of these elements carefully. So insurance costs, that's G, those can add up, right? Insurance companies determine premiums based on the relative risk of an operation. So think about industrial accidents we've heard about, like the chemical fire and explosion in a solvent and ink manufacturing facility in Danvers in 2006. How does the potential for such a catastrophic event impact an insurance company's willingness to take on that risk? Also, worker comp insurance, which should go down if the risk of injury to workers is reduced. Companies may be able to negotiate more favorable environmental liability insurance if risk is reduced by eliminating toxics. But all of these are things that you need to work directly with your insurance rep to get a better handle on. And they can really add up. So, encourage you to think about it. In H, we're looking at liability costs in the event of an accidental release. So we know that remediation of soil or surface or groundwater can be very expensive. And Colin will be talking a little bit about that later on. Think about your facility's history with accidental releases. Even if it's never happened, it could happen. And that's why companies develop contingency plans. So I recommend you determine what the worst case scenario of an accidental release at your facility might be and try to factor that into your cost of toxics determination. You want to check in with the people who are responsible for responding to accidents and in accordance with your site's contingency plan to get a better handle on what those costs might be. In I, we're looking at something that's really hard to pin down, loss of community goodwill. It's a tough one to quantify. Is your manufacturing facility situated near a residential or commercial property? And Could emissions from your facility impact their property value, their worker health, their community health? Hard to pin down, something to think about. What would the cost to your facility be if a regulatory or legal action was initiated based on your use of or release of toxics? These are things you need to think about. What are the opportunity costs if you lag behind your competitors as they improve their formulations and processes? So things to think about. And then Jay, that's the catch-all. If there are other costs that your facility considers when making financial decisions, it's important to have a conversation with the right people to determine what those factors might be so that you can assess if they are relevant in your cost of toxics determination. The next step is so important and it's unique to each operation. As a TUR planner, you need to include cost elements that your facility or client considers when making any financial decision. And you should include the same sources of information they use to ensure that you are applying the standard accounting methods employed at your facility. So think about, do you talk to purchasing folks or financial strategic decision makers? Do you talk to vendors or equipment suppliers? Do you talk to the operations folks for information on production or facilities related costs? The environmental health and safety people for worker protection and liability costs, or the regulatory compliance costs? Talk to the sales or marketing or communications people about the potential financial impact of loss of customers or impacting the general public goodwill. You're not going to get all the information you need from just one source. So you want to think about who you want to talk to, and we'll talk about that in the breakout in just a minute. So I really want you to share your insights for what has worked well for you, what cost elements you think about, what are cost elements that go beyond the list that we showed in just a minute ago. But remember that costs change over time, and sometimes they do go up and sometimes they actually go down. It really depends on what you're doing and what chemicals and materials you're using. So I think that one of your most important tools is questioning assumptions. Was a cost that was quoted to you 2 years ago still valid? Maybe, but find out. Don't just assume that it is still valid. Think about what's going on in the world right now. The supply chain may be really disrupted since the last time you looked at costs because of tariffs and things that are happening right now. So things in the economic world change all the time. So don't assume that any cost that you got in the past is still valid. Okay. Whew. So that was a lot. And I want to start a breakout discussion. So again, I hope that you've all taken a minute to jot down what some of the cost elements that you think about are. We're going to break you into small groups to have a conversation. I encourage you to turn on your video so that you can talk to each other's faces and talk about which cost elements you routinely consider. What do you find challenging to quantify? Where do you get the data? And just what have you learned? What are your best practices? We're going to have somebody from the TUR program in each of the rooms, and so they'll help move the discussion along if needed. Agnes, can you go ahead and start that for me, or shall I? Great.
I just opened all the rooms.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'll give you a 1 minute, ending time. Yeah, go for it.
We talked about, costs that are easier to quantify versus costs that are more difficult to quantify. And two that came up that are difficult to quantify is the difference in labor costs, for handling or using a hazardous chemical versus safer alternative. So being able to quantify that difference.
Right.
And also calculating the hypothetical cost associated with a release, an accidental release. that facilities might be aware that it's a possibility and that there would be costs involved, but knowing exactly what those are can be
Right.
difficult. And I know Office of Technical Assistance, OTA, has done a lot of work on accidental releases. So they may know more about that.
Right, and it's a really good point that there are resources to help, and it's not an easy thing, and we get that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again because we've got a lot to cover, and I want to give Colin plenty of time to share what he's talking about. But we're going to touch back on some of the things that you've talked about together, and please feel free to ask questions as we go. So the next step, once you've identified the cost elements that are relevant to your operation and gathered the best data that you can, then you go on to determine your cost of toxics. And it's important to remember in this step that you are not just gathering the cost, the total cost per year. You, under the Toxics Use Reduction Act, are required to also look at that cost per unit of product. And why do we do that? Well, we do that for the same reason that we do it when we're doing reporting. We want to be looking at numbers that are not influenced by how production may be fluctuating over the course of years. We want to make sure that we're really normalizing our data so we can get a better sense of whether or not the costs are increasing, and not just because of production, but because something else is happening. And that can really influence your economic evaluation determination later on. So a toxic use reduction option that you identified 4 years ago and said technically feasible, not economically feasible. Now, because of changes in how costs impact your facility, that option may now be economically feasible. So it's important to look at both the total cost and the cost per unit of product. You're required to include that in your plan. So I just wanted to stress that. And we're going to hear several examples of companies that have assessed their cost of toxics and the impact of implementing TUR when Colin joins us. So in the guidance document, there is a suggested form that's offered, Exhibit 4, the optional form. And it is a way of getting, tabulating all of the data that you need under TUR to assess your cost of toxics. It's intended to be useful. I don't know if everybody uses it, and you certainly don't have to use it. But I think it gives us some good guidance on what are the things that we have to think about. Is the cost element relevant? If it's not, you have, explain why. So here's where you could have the documentation. This is why it's not relevant to our operation. If it's relevant, but you can't quantify it, why? So put that in there. And then what is the cost or savings associated with that use of that chemical per year and per unit of product? So it breaks down all the cost elements by manufacturing costs, material and waste management costs, regulatory compliance costs, worker health and safety costs, insurance costs, potential liability costs, and then opportunity costs. So it's good in that it guides you to think about all of the things that are required to be thought about. This is not an easy thing to do. Your analysis must be based on the costs of using the covered toxic in the calendar year prior to the planning year. So that's the calendar year that would be covered by your annual toxic use reduction report, your annual report, Form S report, that you would be submitting alongside your plan summary. So that's an important point to remember. And how do we deal with these hard to quantify elements? And I think in that conversation you just had with your peers, you can see that there are a lot of hard to quantify aspects of cost, relevant cost. So a qualitative analysis is about identifying which of those hard to quantify cost elements would change if the covered toxic chemical used was reduced or eliminated. So in your plan, you need to state whether the cost would increase or decrease if you were eliminating it. And you need to indicate sort of the relative magnitude of the change. And how you do that is up to you, but you do need to do those things. So one approach would be to estimate a range based on your best available data. Or if you can't find any data, you can note the possible impact on the overall cost based on feedback that you've gotten from your sources of information and the weight that cost factor plays in your facility's normal decision-making process. So, oops, oh, why did that happen? So in this example here, this company had numbers for chemical storage and labor, but not for the other cost elements, and they that they consider to be most relevant. So let's say that these are the elements that they say are relevant to their operation. And it looks like for this company, the opportunity costs are particularly of interest to them at this point in time. And that may change with time, but for right now, it seems like competition to be safer is a priority for this company. And so, as a planner, you would be wanting to talk to marketing and sales, but maybe even going all the way up the chain to the CEO or president of your facility to get a better handle on why that's a priority and what the costs of the company would be and what the savings would be if you could eliminate your use of the toxic chemical. So there's a lot of intangibles like that. And you need to really kind of think clearly about what that is. You need to explain in your plan why you can't quantify it, and you need to describe what its likely impact would be if you were able to eliminate the use of the toxic chemical. Okay, I'm going to move on. Step 4 is about allocating costs to production units, and this is important. You need to allocate the costs to the individual production units where that toxic chemical is used. Most companies don't think about individual production units as their own cost centers within their business, and so they may not allocate costs by production unit already. And in which case this step might be very unfamiliar to your financial people, and you will want to discuss that you have to do this and why with them so that they can understand and give you the right information. So the allocation method that you use, you need to describe in your plan, and you need to make it as accurate as possible. So we're going to talk about 2 different ways that companies can allocate costs in the next 2 slides. But remember that any assumptions that you make as you do this must be clearly articulated in your TUR plan. All right, we'll start with conventional accounting. So many companies use this system, which allocates costs across the operation according to the amount of labor associated with the different activities. So if you want to know how much electricity one production unit uses, for example, but you only have 1 meter for electricity entering your facility, it's hard to figure out how much electricity is being used in an individual production unit. So in this case, you would just say, well, 50% of the electricity should be applied to production unit A because 50% of our people are working there. That would be an example of how a company might use conventional accounting to help them get a handle on how to allocate different costs across production units. So production unit A, 50% of the overall facility labor is expended there. So they apply 50% of the cost for electricity, natural gas, toxics use, or any other overhead item to that production unit. On the other hand, production unit B is only responsible for or only uses 10% of the facility's labor. So in this accounting method, they would only have 10% of the overhead costs applied to their activities. But what happens if production unit B is where all the toxic chemical use is happening? In this conventional accounting methodology, you now are looking at potentially underestimating the impact of implementing toxics use reduction. You're underestimating the impact of the cost of using the toxics. And you make the incentive for reducing toxics from a financial perspective really, really, underwhelming. Because if you were able to eliminate all your toxics in production unit B, you're still only going to be using this counting method, impacting 10% of that cost in the financial planning side of it. So imagine how much of a hurdle you as a planner would have to overcome to demonstrate that implementing toxics use reduction would be economically feasible if the cost of toxics baseline you're comparing to was only 10% of the actual number. Managers wouldn't have a lot of incentive to implement TUR because even if they eliminate the toxic, very little financial credit would be attributed to that production unit. Most would be assumed costs related to toxics that are used elsewhere, which may not actually be true. So conventional accounting is used because it's easier, and it may just be the way that your business has done it all along, but it may present some challenges in really getting a good firm handle on what the cost of toxics by production unit actually is. So the other way to do it is activity-based accounting. And here you get a better understanding of the real cost of using the toxic chemical in any particular production unit. But it also means that you need to have a better handle on the relative amount of different overhead costs that can be attributed to each of your production units. So in this method, the costs are borne in proportion to their use by every production unit. So now production unit B is 100% responsible for the costs associated with using toxics, giving its managers much more incentive to reduce use if it results in savings. And it gives the planner a more realistic baseline to compare the costs of implementing as you think about your economic feasibility of a preferred TUR option. So again, in order to do this kind of activity-based accounting, you need to be able to have a better handle on the proportional use of different overhead cost elements by production unit. And that can be challenging, and trying to change the way that a facility accounts for costs can be really hard to do. Remember, as in TUR planning, you need to be using the accounting method that best matches how your company does accounting. And so that's a little bit challenging here, but I think that there are benefits to trying to make that happen. So I'm going to move on. We had a conversation with Department of Environmental Protection folks about what they've observed in recent reviews of toxics use reduction plans. And one of the biggest issues they've seen is filers forgetting to identify the cost of toxics completely. And this is more commonly seen with companies who indicate that they don't have any feasible options. So if there are no technically feasible options, you don't have to quantify cost of toxics, but you are required to identify the cost elements that are relevant and get a qualitative sense of what the cost is. whether or not you have technically feasible options. So that's one of the things DEP has seen quite a bit of. The other major issue they've seen is tied to math, which shows up in a couple different ways. So forgetting to correct cost numbers from plan cycle to plan cycle or from year to year. You cannot assume that a cost that you used 2 years ago is going to be the same as it is this year. So you absolutely have to go back and double check and make sure you're using the right data. Using usage amounts, which are completely different from any number in the remainder of the plan. So there have been many instances where companies, their planning doesn't agree, the planning and reporting doesn't agree. So as a planner, you need to make sure that you're using the right current and accurate information. And so DEP has seen plans where the numbers just don't match. Not checking your math or not using the right way of rounding numbers, or being inconsistent, that can impact what your math turns out to be, what your determination is. So be very meticulous. In many cases, companies use spreadsheets like Excel, which is great, but one of the things that you need to do is make sure that you are including that in your plan, or at a bare minimum saying where that spreadsheet can be found. What you don't want is to require an inspector to have to kind of, do some digging to find the math. That's an indication that there might be something wrong, and you don't want to give an inspector that sense up front that you're not being transparent. So be careful to make sure that what you use, what data you use, what numbers you use are really easy to find and understandable. And to that point, really explaining what cost elements you're looking at and why they're relevant, and why other cost elements are not relevant has to be in there, and has to really be clear. And we've also heard stories of inspectors going on site and sharing cost of toxics data with senior management who had absolutely no idea where those numbers could have come from. That's a red flag, man. You need to do a good job of making sure that you're using the right data. So the next step is economic evaluation, and I really don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to give Colin plenty of time. Again, this is from that graphic in the guidance document. Once you've identified your cost of toxics, you're going to do your economic evaluation of whether or not a TUR option is feasible. And these are the cost elements that you have to think about. The depth in which you go with an economic analysis really depends on having sufficient information to make an informed business decision. And doing that in accordance with your existing company financial decision-making practices. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. Whatever data you use, please make it legible. Again, you want your inspectors to be able to understand what you're doing and why, and where you got the information from. Your cost of toxics determination is the basis for the evaluation of an economic feasibility. And you can use that as a quick screening tool, cautiously, I should just say. So if the cost of implementing a toxics use reduction option is several times the maximum possible savings you would see if you could eliminate your toxic chemical use, you could consider that to be economically infeasible and move on. But you have to do that in good faith, using the best current information and assumptions that you can. The guidance points out that there's a lot of indirect or overhead costs that could have a real impact on whether or not you can say that an option is in fact economically feasible. So do a good and thorough job with your cost of toxics and with your economic evaluation to make sure that you're making the right decision. You can tabulate in whatever way makes sense for you. Important to note that you should be using the same protocol for identifying and allocating costs for each TUR option you're considering. All right, so don't use a different set of criteria for one option than you would another. And remember that what's relevant for your use of a toxic chemical may not be relevant when thinking about TUR option implementation, or vice versa. And importantly, always think about the quality or the reliability of the estimates that you're using before you start your financial analysis. Planners use this information to make a recommendation to implement toxics use reduction. Remember, however, in Massachusetts, companies are not required to implement, right? And there's many reasons why a company may choose not to implement, but you as the planner need to do this good faith assessment of whether there are options that you think should be implemented, okay? And there's many different reasons why companies might choose not to, and that is really not the responsibility of the planner themselves. Oops. So there are some tools that you can use that can be helpful. I'm really not going to go into that. I want to hand this over to Colin, but the slides are available on our website. I want you to remember that a thorough cost of toxics analysis supports your facility's decision on whether and when to implement TUR, so it's important. And relative costs are not simply the capital equipment costs and the contractor expenses. There's a lot more that can influence this determination, and you as a planner have an obligation to really think this through. And then finally, just remember that costs change. You need to consider the accuracy of your estimates and question whether or not a cost that was assumed to be something 2 years ago is still the same, or if that assumption itself was even valid. So, lot there. Now I'm going to hand it over to Colin. And Colin, I hope you have your cup of coffee with you. So we're going to hear some more about competitiveness. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Pam. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
And you see the screen?
Yes.
And I have coffee.
Excellent.
It's Dunkin' Donuts. This is the Toxic Use Reduction Institute of Massachusetts. So yeah, thanks Pam for the intro, and thanks everybody for coming. My name is Colin Hanahan. I'm a policy analyst here at TUR, and I'm going to be speaking on kind of a similar topic as Pam, but more looking at it through the perspective of how businesses, facilities in Massachusetts and beyond can improve their competitive advantage, save money on toxics through toxics use reduction. And the hope here is that we can help, bring some of those costs from qualitative to quantitative, and also maybe provide a bit of firepower when it comes to going ahead with implementation. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of context on TUR, maybe for those in the audience who are not planners and not from Massachusetts, in the context of toxic use reduction as the most cost-effective approach for protecting public health. Then I'll give a bit of background on competitiveness under TUR, and then we'll do kind of a deep dive into the different ways which TUR can improve competitiveness and save money for businesses. So TUR, I know many of you already know what it is. Enacted in 1989, it has kind of three main legal requirements that companies report on their use of chemicals that are on the TUR list of substances. They have to prepare evaluations. Those are the plans Pam's been talking about. and they have to pay fees based on their business size and chemical use, which can be theoretically lowered if they reduce their use of chemicals. So TUR focuses on those 3 types of solutions to address hazardous chemicals that are on the top of this pyramid. And 2 important notes are that the list of toxic substances can be updated, and it does not ban or restrict any substances. Inclusion on that list does not mean it's restricted, but the legislation focuses on solutions. So, as I said, we're going to talk a bit about how TUR is the best solution for protecting public and worker health from hazardous chemicals. And this is shown in the numbers. I mean, between 1997 and 2017, 21 billion spent by taxpayers on the Superfund program to clean up pollution. So that doesn't even include the money paid by a company that may have been found liable for that pollution. And PFAS, always a hot topic. A study by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or commissioned by them, found that removing and destroying PFAS from wastewater can cost up to $18 million per pound. So that's pretty expensive. And it's a nice segue to show how here at TUR and in the TUR program, we focus on upstream solutions. This slide kind of helps document how we might go about that, or one case in which we might go about that. Transine, I'll talk a bit more about them later. They approached TUR for help to get rid of a PFAS element in their surfactant for one of their microelectronics etching products. And then through a modest research grant, TUR and UMass Lowell and Transine engaged in a collaboration to get PFAS out of that formulation. So one way or another, that might have ended up in the environment, and we were able to prevent that use in the first place. And we have found that this type of approach works. These graphs show how chemicals have been used and release and byproduct generation have been reduced significantly since 2000 and since the inception of TUR. It's been specifically very effective at reducing the use and release and potential exposure to very hazardous chemicals that cause harm, such as asthmagens or carcinogens. So that was just kind of a introduction to TUR and why it's good for public health. And now I kind of want to shift gears and focus on TUR and TUR, how it can save money for businesses and provide them with a competitive advantage. And this is in the context of a resource we're developing here at TUR to highlight some of the achievements of companies over the past 10 years under TUR, how they've created a safer workplace and reduced the release of hazardous chemicals in the environment. So I hope that this presentation can kind of be the beginning of a discussion where businesses can share their own achievements with me, or say, hey, like you're missing this in your calculation, or that's an overestimate. So yeah, I just hope this can be the beginning of a discussion, because we're always looking for opportunities to highlight achievements and listen to filers. So TUR has a long history of promoting competitiveness of businesses in Massachusetts and beyond and saving them money. P2 grants, I know that's not TUR, but that focuses on toxic use reduction solutions. That saved 2.3 billion for companies between 2011 and 2022 who received those grants. And the report that we're developing here is building on a report from 2016, which highlighted kind of sector by sector some key examples of businesses that have saved money under TUR. And it was found that in 2017, 4.5 million savings per year were achieved by businesses as a result of TUR implementation. So you can check out that report. It's really interesting and has a lot of good stuff in it. And the services provided by TUR program agencies, TUR and the Office of Technical Assistance, really try to focus on how we can help businesses, how we can help them save money And this slide highlights kind of those different areas of services. And the first case study I'll highlight is of Boyd, which, after a 6-year collaboration with TUR, they were able to switch away from a hazardous solvent. They saved $31,000 annually, reduced their cleaning time, reduced their labor input. And I guess I'd like to emphasize that it was a long collaboration, and that we recognize that a lot of these solutions that companies are looking to implement are difficult to develop, and it can be a big leap of faith to finally decide to make that investment. So we hope that these services can help companies get over the hump, and that seeing these numbers, these savings, can also act to contribute to deciding to go ahead and implement. And we'll be hearing from Boyd at a webinar in November a bit more on their work with the TUR agencies and with their cleaner chemical innovation. So stay tuned for that. And a really nice example of what can come of really focusing tourist services and collaboration with businesses on a particular area of hazardous chemicals can be shown through halogenated solvents. Over the past 10, maybe a little less than 10 years, we were able to come up with these numbers. These are the results of savings of companies which received TUR grants. High number of annual savings, a lot of investment into cleaner chemical innovation, a safer workplace, and not pictured here is a 50% reduction in release of these hazardous solvents. And as I said before, a lot of these switching to a safer alternative can be difficult for a business. It can be costly, and the services provided by TUR and OTA can really help offset some of these costs. So this table is from an industry study on the cost of switching to a safer chemical solution from a halogenated solvent for industrial cleaning. It helps quantify the time and money needed to do certain activities related to making that switch. And companies in Massachusetts have free access to services that help offset these costs. So we hope that that can help, get companies over the hump and reap the benefits of TUR implementation, which I'll talk more about now. So what I'll talk about now is I'll kind of do a deeper dive into the different ways which TUR can help to improve the competitiveness of businesses and save them money. So the first one I'll talk about is improved productivity and efficiency. An AIHA study found that hazard elimination overall and safer substitution can create efficiencies throughout business operations and manufacturing processes as well. And that is really evidenced in the numbers found in TUR data. So since 2000, a core group of filers have reduced their generation of waste, of hazardous waste, by 73%. That's adjusted for production. And that's going along with a 51% overall increase in productivity among TUR filers. And we'd like to think that the technical support that businesses have access to in Massachusetts is helping them to make a bigger impact than in other states. And the numbers show that there's been greater reductions than in 43 other states. So a really nice case study of a company that improved their efficiency and productivity through TUR is CD Aero, now known as Knowles, I believe. And they engaged with TUR to implement a cleaner chemical innovation for their cleaning process. They saved $46,000 annually. They were able to reclaim almost 2,000 feet squared of manufacturing space, which is really nice and kind of a less thought about benefit of TUR. Increased their throughput by 68% and reduced their maintenance labor by 33%. So that's a nice example of how TUR can have kind of the side effect. Maybe they're not even, a lot of companies might not be thinking about this possibility of increase productivity. And we have other examples of that. And we're also looking for more. So if you have any, please reach out. So the second kind of area of improved competitiveness I'll talk about is compliance and market position. And companies in Massachusetts have often been better prepared to comply and improve their position in the supply chain as a result of TUR. And on the left half of this slide, these are the results from a few surveys on public support for government regulation. I know there's a lot of change going on at the federal level with how the EPA is operating, but I think that we're in a real moment of bipartisan support for strong chemical regulation. It's something that the people want. So this is supported by these numbers. These are bipartisan surveys, the second one, and the top one is a global survey. So that is to say that bans strong chemical regulation outside of Massachusetts, you can expect that to come down the pipeline. And when you as a business are able to be in compliance with those upcoming regulations, even if they're not in effect yet, these businesses can really improve their position in the supply chain. And this was evidenced in the Transine case study, which I know I mentioned earlier. They responded to customer demands, downstream demands for PFAS-free products. They were able to meet that demand through engagement with TUR and UMass Lowell, and that strengthened their position in the supply chain, in the electronic supply chain. So other businesses have that opportunity and can be thinking about that. So I mentioned those bans. Under TSCA, that's the federal chemical regulation, we're starting to see some of these first restrictions on chemicals, specifically for the halogenated solvents. They're kind of in flux right now, but we can expect that at some point they're going to maybe impact how you do business. They may be going to completely ban that chemical from your operations or require you to implement costly workplace protection requirements. So TUR has the ability to designate a substance as a higher hazard, and that is not a ban, but it lowers the reporting threshold and is able to connect more businesses with TUR program services. More businesses will engage with the TUR planning process, and that's been really effective at getting these companies to stop or reduce their use of halogenated solvents. This table shows the reduction in 3 halogenated solvents that are now facing EPA bans. They've all reduced users significantly since receiving that HHS designation. And so here on the right side of the slide is kind of a cost analysis, which is based on an EPA required report for the cost of compliance with the current trichloroethylene rule, specifically for the costs of implementing those workplace protection requirements for different applications. So I took an example here of a facility that is using TCE in their open-top vapor degreasing operations with 5 workers. And it kind of breaks down the different costs for skin protection, respiratory protection, and administrative costs. And as you can see from the numbers, if you're using TCE and you're going to implement this workplace protection program, you're going to incur significant costs. $10,000 upfront, over $22,000 per year. And a lot of businesses under TUR who have engaged with the planning process, engaged with TUR agencies, have avoided these costs. And since we're expecting to see more bans coming down the pipeline 10, 20 years from now, it takes a long time. It's important to consider how you might be avoiding these costs in the future. When you're just doing your economic evaluation, when you're assessing the cost of toxics. I know it can be hard to think about, but there's resources out there that really look to quantify these costs. So keep those in mind. There's similar reports for methylene chloride and perchloroethylene that break down these costs. And then finally, for improved compliance and market position, there's a range of other regulatory costs, and there's resources from the EPA and others which quantify these costs. For example, an EPA resource estimates that filing a single Form R can cost $2,481 per year. Complying with the upcoming TSCA Section 8 PFAS record keeping rule. If you're using PFAS, you're going to have to find some information on that use as a high cost. And engaging with TUR can help reduce these costs, reduce the labor associated with using toxics. So Steel Art, they engage with TUR program agencies to completely eliminate their use of a halogenated solvent. They lost their status as a TUR filer at all. So they avoided TUR fees. They avoided the costs associated with TUR planning. They reduced costs related to hazardous waste compliance with RCRA. And that's not even to mention the significant savings they achieved on chemical and energy efficiency, which I will talk about now. This is the final kind of theme on enhancing your competitive advantage through TUR, and that's resource efficiency and operating costs. So TUR can help companies use less chemicals, improve their energy efficiency, and also reduce costs related to PPE. And TUR planning is a really good opportunity to reveal the opportunities for these costs, for savings on these costs. And I'd also like to remind everyone about resource conservation planning, which can be, more focused on finding these types of savings. So I won't get too deeply into this, but we've been able to find a lot of examples of companies that have lowered their purchasing for chemicals costs and improved their energy efficiency through TUR planning. Umicore is a great example. They saved over $21,500 a year on chemicals and electricity after eliminating perchloroethylene from their operations. So these final two slides, they try to get at those difficult to quantify costs, on liability, on community reputation, that can be integrated into economic evaluation, but often are not due to just, it's a hard thing to understand. What are those costs? But this report by Cleaner Production Action and Investor Environmental Health Network does a really good job of outlining the risks that your facility might be taking on as a result of toxics use. And they split it into the policy and regulation risks. I know environmental justice is being de-emphasized at the federal level, but there's still a lot of action at the state level on integrating that into policy and law. Litigation risk specifically due to PFAS is growing exponentially. It's been called the new tobacco. And it gets into community reputation and how, using safer chemicals and engaging in TUR can really improve your relationship with the community and can make operating a lot easier. And when you need something, when a problem arises, it's a lot better to have a good relationship with your community than not. So I just want to highlight this report. It's a really good resource for companies that might be looking to, prioritize certain chemicals to address those risks I mentioned in the last slide. It will help maybe see where or which facilities are using particularly hazardous chemicals or might be specifically relevant to the challenges faced by the communities they're in. So that's a good resource. And then I won't get too deep into this slide so we can have a little time for discussion, but TUR planning is an amazing opportunity to address those risks related to environmental justice and community relations, to really operationalize and do it. And this just goes through how you can do that at different steps during employee notification. You can mention that environmental justice is being considered, provide it in different languages. In the management statement, you can reiterate your commitment and recognize the potential of the planning process. During TUR options, you can identify those priority toxics that I mentioned in the last slide that are relevant to the specific health risks of the community or your workers. Technical evaluation, and then economic evaluation. It would be great to have examples of how you might try to quantify those risks during this step, although I know it is difficult. And then implementation plan, maybe if you have a big win during toxic use reduction planning implementation, you can include some kind of community outreach, show that you're really caring about this topic and use that to strengthen your ties with the local community. So I will stop there. Looks like we have about 5 minutes for discussion. It's not a long time, but we're developing this resource and we wanted to help companies. We wanted to inspire companies to go ahead with implementation. We wanted to help them during cost of toxics evaluation and economic evaluation during TUR planning. So if right now you have examples or questions of calculating savings or any requests from us, please let me know via email or just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I really want to encourage folks to go ahead and if you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and ask. Colin, there was one question in the chat that you've touched a bit on, but I just want to point out, Fatima asks, how can we quantify the impact on the fence line communities? So emissions to surrounding environment from the facility?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm not able to click on the chat, but
okay.
It's a difficult thing to quantify. There actually is a explicit quantification of those public health costs, for example, in the EPA resources on the upcoming restrictions for those halogenated solvents. They try to evaluate those costs, the exposure to fence line communities. So I'd be happy to share that. And I think there might be some other things out there.
And you also, your next slide has resources that you pulled from in a lot of the data and discussion that you presented so well. So all of that is on the slides and they're available on our website already. But yeah, if there's anything else that people, if there are any other questions that we have about cost of toxics, about competitiveness, now is a really great time to say, hey, I heard this thing and I don't understand it, or I have this tip that I really want to share, or we've done this really important thing that I want to connect with the TUR program about. Go. All right, any questions or thoughts from anybody in the room? Colin, I cut you off a little and I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. But yeah.
No, that's okay. I see there's some questions in the chat that we would love to follow up on in writing. And also that we will be reaching out to some of the companies whose little case studies I put in this report to let them know that we're looking to highlight these and if there's anything else that we should include. And yeah. Here's
So
my
we've got a
email.
lot of really great companies in Massachusetts and companies who have been really committed to looking at their use of toxics and reducing it. And yeah, I think that there's a lot more that we could be saying if companies were willing to kind of share. So we really want to encourage that. Thank you, Colin, so much for doing such a great job of kind of laying out the big picture of where all the opportunities are. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Agnes, for helping to organize all of this. And I want to share, if you don't mind stopping sharing, I just want to remind folks that we do have, oops, that's not what I wanted to share. We do have a couple other webinars that are happening. We have October 8th, we're going to be talking about ways that we and other organizations evaluate chemicals of concern. We're going to be talking in November, on November 19th, about specific examples of what companies have done. Agnes put the link to where you can see more about each of these on our website. And on December 9th, we're going to be talking about how we might be able to use or not use our artificial intelligence, AI, or machine learning to help support our toxics use reduction planning and implementation. So that will be really interesting. Lots of good opportunity to have a conversation. I look forward to seeing many, or not, if not all of you there. So I'm gonna let you all go now. Thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks.